Welcome everyone to a new episode of Diaspora Voices, where we normally interview members of the Kashmiri diaspora settled somewhere in the world away from Kashmir. Today our program is slightly different in that we're interviewing someone whose work has benefited the diaspora, our community, especially our language. So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Leena Robertson. We're going to hear about her work, especially in relation to the Pahari language. So welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here. Very, very pleased.
Yeah, good. So what are you doing currently?
So currently I am working in a university, London University. I've been there rather a long time. And at the moment I work with research students. So that is students who are preparing their doctoral studies. So that'll be PhDs and professional doctorates. And it's very, very fulfilling and interesting and enjoyable. I think this will be how I will end my career doing this kind of work. It wasn't how I started.
Okay. Do you want to say how you started with your academic life?
With pleasure. I was recently in a group of women who were thinking, I think this is quite a common question that is asked today, that if you were a superhero, what would your power be? What would be your superpower? And all sorts of colleagues and friends were suggesting all sorts of things. And many were saying, oh, I don't know what my superpower would be. And I said, I don't need to hesitate with this answer because I know I am a teacher.
Okay.
So I started as a primary school teacher, teaching the youngest of children, sometimes nursery school children and sometimes 5 and 6 year olds. I think my heart is with the 5-year-olds, the ones who are just starting school and beginning to navigate that new cultural place, new social space where slightly different rules operate to the ones from home. And that's true to all children. So that's where I started. And then, and I tell you about the schools I taught maybe a bit later, and then moved into, at some point, universities. And for a long time, I worked with teacher training programs. And worked with early years teachers and primary school teachers who were getting ready to get the QTS, qualified teacher status. And then hoping to go into school. And that, again, was a very, very satisfying bit of my work. So that's who I am, teacher through.
Okay. Good. So from teaching, you moved into academia through teacher training?
Say that again. From teaching, I moved into academia.
Through teacher training?
Yes. I first became a lecturer in a different university, and I supported teacher training programs. I was their English lecturer, which was quite good and interesting, since I am not English. So I was born in Finland, and that's where I went to school. And when I was 20, I decided to come to England after my school and my equivalent of A-levels. And I wasn't too sure what to do with my life. I knew that I wanted to go to university, but wasn't quite sure what I would like to study. So I thought, I'm coming to England as an au pair. And I worked in a family in London. And it was fascinating, again, very interesting experience to come and live in somebody else's house. And this was a Jewish family in London. And they weren't very religious, but they had maintained many of their Sabbath rituals. And it was interesting to learn about that. And then very, very quickly, having arrived in London, I met my first husband. and then decided to stay. And we had children, but I had children very early, very happy years, had 2 boys, and I was a stay-at-home mum with them.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So was this the first time you left Finland?
Correct. Yes. 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 And I mean, I traveled a little bit. I was very interested in languages. I thought maybe I'd sort of travel around the world and learn, practice more languages, and then maybe at some point go back to Finland. But the fate decided differently, and I've never regretted it. London is a fascinating place, isn't it? All big cities in England, I think, they are sort of so full of color and cultures and different people that arriving from a different place was relatively easy to settle. London, I felt, was very welcoming. We had Italian neighbors. We had neighbors from Nigeria. We had neighbors from sort of Southern Europe, Greece, and various places, and Ireland too, and Scottish. So it was very, very multilingual, and it was very, very sort of rich in ethnicities and faiths. So really good place to be.
And of course, you will have been bilingual already, probably multilingual, and you were then exposed to all of these different cultures and languages. Is that what got you into researching bilingualism, multilingualism?
Kind of. I mean, Finland invests a lot in language education. So yes, I had studied various different languages, and English was my favorite. I also studied French and German, and Swedish is our second national language. But I really was keen to, I think, children or youngsters of my generation, we were drawn to film and pop music, and England and America was the place to be. So what got me into bilingualism and multilingualism, I need to tell you how I kind of woke up to certain factors. So I had been in England about 4 years when my first son was born, and I was in the maternity hospital in London, and he'd just been born, and the sort of everything got a bit quiet. My son's father went back home, and there was nobody in the room, and there was I with my baby. And I started talking to him. We had made a family decision that I would always speak to him in Finnish, and my partner would speak in English. Right. And there I was at the maternity hospital talking to my first baby in Finnish.
Okay.
And the midwife pops back into the room just to check that I'm okay, hears me talking in Finnish, and said, right. Oh no, Mrs. Robertson, don't do that. Don't do that. You are confusing your child. Don't do that. Okay. Stop. Yeah. Stop. And I was taken back, and I was a young girl, didn't have the confidence I have today. So I didn't say anything. I certainly didn't challenge this much older woman and my midwife. I kind of felt my life depended on her a bit now, physical bits anyway.
Yeah.
And she went away, but I stayed obviously in the room with my baby and thought, well, I don't think so. I don't think like that. So I carried on talking to my son in Finnish, but whispering. I wasn't confident enough to say it out loud.
Sure.
By the time my second son was born, I didn't give a toss what other people thought.
Yes.
I'd seen by then, my older one was 1.5 years, and I knew how brilliantly he coped with mum speaking Finnish and dad speaking English, and how the shared language at home was English, and how he just was really comfortably switched from one language to another, depending who he spoke to. So that's what first got me interested in these issues about multilingualism and bilingualism, and how hard it was to find a voice about talking about these matters. It's that I felt that people in authority said something different to that I didn't accept, I didn't believe, but who nevertheless had power over me.
Yes. So I guess it's a case of, because you knew about bilingualism, and in your case multilingualism, because you spoke Finnish, Swedish, French, German, and now English. That's a lot of languages.
Yeah, I mean, you're being you'll be very polite. I had studied them, and French was okay, and Swedish not too bad, but by now, I've forgotten them all. So I would say that I am bilingual. I'm no longer multilingual because I haven't had the opportunity to practice those languages regularly. I suppose if I moved to one of those places, it would come back. But I wasn't then, and certainly am not now, very skilled in the other languages.
Yes. In my experience, bilingualism or languages is something, if you don't use it, you lose it. And I didn't learn as many languages as yourself, but for 2 years, I was exposed to English, Farsi, Arabic, Urdu, while speaking Pahari. And English, obviously, I built upon when I arrived in England. Arabic and Farsi, I have lost. Occasionally, there are words that are similar in Urdu, but most of the time, I've lost those languages. But what it did do for me, and I'm sure it did for you, is very early on, as a first year in secondary school, at the age of 10, it told me that there were different ways of speaking and different ways of reading. In other words, there were different languages in the world. And I think that is critical. Do you find that in terms of our attitudes to learning languages?
Absolutely. I think we need to really accept that the world is multilingual. The majority of populations always, I think, have spoken more than one language. That is certainly true today, even if it hasn't always been the case with all remote communities. But so we are surrounded by people who's, particularly now in urban spaces and in most sort of Western countries and places, and around the world too. I mean, Pakistan is a really good example of that, as are many others, where languages have existed coinciding for generations. And it's normal, it's everyday, it's not exotic, it's not something to be constantly celebrated. It's just what we do as human beings. I'm all about also sort of thinking about languages and celebrating the variety of ways that we can express things. But that's a different thing to celebrating somebody who speaks many languages, having been identified then, as often happens in England, that they are kind of exotic and special because they speak more than one language. So London particularly, I think, is an interesting place because, of course, it's the most multilingual in the globe at the moment. Today, there are at least 350 languages spoken in primary schools, probably growing as we speak, the number of them. So it's an aspect of human life.
Yes.
Yes.
But within that, would you say that there is a hierarchy of languages or hierarchy of bilingualisms in the plural?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. So when I came to England, Finland was not in European Union.
Right.
And very little was known about Finland in England then. And the people I met at that family where I was au pairing, for example, they would ask me questions like, do you have a television in Finland?
Yes.
Or do you have roads? Because we know that there's lots of snow and, the winters are hard. Do you have roads?
Yes.
And when my boys went to primary school, their process of learning to read wasn't very easy. They didn't learn to read as quickly as most of their schoolmates. And before they were diagnosed as dyslexic, having a sort of learning difficulty in terms of learning to read, particularly in their case, as had been the case of their father, as incidentally is now the case with my son's children, the sons. So we've got dyslexic boys in our family now for 3 generations.
Right.
But when they didn't learn to read so easily, the teacher noted that they had difficulties in rhyming, so making rhyming word, picking out the pairs. And this is a difficulty that some dyslexic children have. They find it difficult to hear the pattern and focus on the pattern of the sound. But the teacher thought that this was because I had spoken Finnish to them and had not taught them English nursery rhymes.
Right.
And again, the teacher told me to stop speaking Finnish. And I was so shocked because I thought, well, I've surrounded them by books. I mean, you only need to look at my home. I'm in my front room and you can see how many books we do have.
Yes.
And I had taught them so much Finnish poetry.
Yes.
And again, I was really hurt that the blame was put on being bilingual. Now, in those days, obviously, Finland wasn't very known, so it was kind of put in the same bracket of many Eastern European languages. Today is very different. Finland is known supposedly for its good educational achievement and system. And but then it wasn't. So people were very, very negative about speaking Finnish. So yes, I met the hierarchy. I also have to sort of point out that I met the hierarchy myself, but obviously I'm white. I lived a comfortable life. I wasn't struggling economically. We had no sort of issues to do with I don't know, disabilities or, so I benefited from some privileges, which I do count now. But nevertheless, they that whole business about hierarchies between languages was interesting. And it was such my interest in this whole idea about bilingualism that I decided that when my boys started school, I'm going to become a teacher. And that's when I joined university and went to do my Bachelor of Education. And And there I met people who saw bilingualism differently, who openly spoke about language statuses and hierarchies.
Right. Okay.
And also sort of learned to recognize the baggage that many languages have because of this. So when I then qualified and got to teach in a school that was 60%, the children were of Pakistani origin, sometimes 60%, sometimes 90% came from Pakistan, and they came from Kashmir. I also began to realize how complex these issues to do with hierarchy are, because here were these people telling me that they speak Pahari. And I also knew that the children after school, they often go to the mosque to learn to read the Quran.
Yes.
And then they also wanted, the families and the community wanted them to learn to also speak some Urdu, the national language, so that they can maintain sort of more different kinds of relationships with their country of origin. And how some of the people who worked with us at the school, they often didn't quite get what this Pahari was. So we talked about it at length, absolutely at length. What should we, as a teaching group of teachers and the school and its leadership, what should we say about the children's language? Should we say that it's a Punjabi dialect?
Right.
Should we say something else? And every time we went to the community, they said, no, it's Pahari.
Okay, that's interesting.
We also had, by the time I then had sort of stayed teaching a bit, I did a master's. And during that master's, I had an opportunity to engage with many other researchers and professors of bilingualism. And we met people from Birmingham.
Okay.
And there seemed to be a very similar group of Kashmiri kids in a school. And yet these people called it Punjabi dialect. And they said to us that you can't call it a Punjabi, you cannot call it Pahari, because that's carries so much baggage that it means hill speak or hill language of the, and that means also that then the whole group of people are sort of framed with some kind of negativity, that they are sort of backward hill people. And so we went back to our parents and our community. By then I had developed very good relationships with the children's parents and community elders. And I said, well, I'm terribly sorry if I have offended you by calling it Pahari. And they said, we know all about that kind of stuff. It's the name is our, it means our language. And if other people use it for negative purposes, that's their problem.
Yes.
It is our language and our identity. So I've learned an enormous amount, unbelievable amount from that community of Pahari speakers, and sort of began to explore the different experiences that community people in different communities can have, and realized, of course, that in many ways I had an easy ride coming from Finland, speaking Finnish. So it hadn't been that difficult, but I sort of connected with some small difficulties that I had. I could feel empathy with others, but I totally discovered that there's an awful lot of wrong information there's lots and lots of people who want to maintain something, want to maintain their own powerful position, and therefore do not want to move on and look at different communities differently. So I'm sort of losing my thread here a bit.
No, yeah, that's interesting, and it's very interesting for you to say, because I've got a title, and you've got a title. We are highly educated. You are much more, educated than I am, and for you to say that you learned something from some ordinary people in the Kashmiri community, I think that is very encouraging, very heartening, and I'm sure it will be for any from the Kashmiri community and others, because I think often the researcher goes out, researches, and maybe never heard of again, and takes away the knowledge, benefits from it, and if you're not careful, and if there's no intentionality about it, it could be a form of exploitation. So I'm very encouraged that you are talking about, actually, you're articulating that you benefited from that community.
Absolutely. It opened I was still relatively new in my teaching role, and I was baffled, sort of didn't really always understand what is going on in my classroom teaching the children of Kashmir. And largely because I had got so into teaching reading, and I suppose because my own children had struggled with it, and so combining that with bilingualism, multilingualism, but there were not enough books that helped teachers to teach children who are simultaneously learning to read in more than one language. All the theoretical books, all the books that teachers used to get about teaching children how to learn to read, all those both theoretical books and more sort of teacher books for good ideas or topics or lesson plans, all that. None of them seem to understand or include also multilingual children. So with the help of that community, and it was so lovely teaching there, because of course they all lived around the school. So if I popped into a shop, they'd go, Mrs. Robertson, you taught my cousin's son. Or you go to a restaurant somewhere there, and they'd say, Mrs. Robertson, right, you're going to have a free sagaloo for us or something. So it was a wonderful feeling of community. So anyway, they helped me to come and observe what happens in the Urdu class. And suddenly my eyes are opened. Totally opened how different it was. But even more so, I went to watch and follow what happens when they learn to read the Quran. And there was that one first time when I went to listen, I remember they had all arrived, the children, but clutching a carrier bag, and inside was their Quran. And they'd go and wash themselves, and then they'd come and take the Quran out, and then they'd start reading. And often they fiddled with the carrier bag. So you get this crunchy of the carrier bag, and then the children reciting the Quran. And although by then I knew something about the process of learning to read the Quran, obviously I'd never learned that myself, but I knew something about it. And as the students, the children there, and there was a group of 2 three 10-year-old girls who sat very close to me, and they were reading the Quran, and then one of them said something about one word, and then they start talking about that word.
Yes.
And I said to the girls, I said, well, what does that mean?
Yes.
And they said, we don't know.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And although I knew that this was the case, that one learns to recite the Quran,
Yes.
that you don't read it for meaning in the same sense as English schools. Nevertheless, of course, it's not meaningless.
No.
It's
No.
incredibly meaningful. So much so that the teacher came and said to the girls that you mustn't be speaking and chatting over an open Quran, that's disrespectful. Either close the book or carry on reading. And of course, they carried on reading. And then I began to understand how reading for meaning is also very much a cultural construct. It's what we said, or I said as a teacher in the school, was that children learn to read stories with a meaning so that they can tell what happens in the story. That story knowledge is important. But of course, in the Quran classes, it was very different. It was a sort of bordering on spiritual experience, or so the children and the teachers told me. So I was very privileged to be taken to these contexts and lessons by these community people. And it helped me enormously then to see, so since there were no books about this either, it helped me enormously to begin to think, okay, so what do I need to do in the classroom? What do I need to do? Not necessarily that I got to change everything, and you can't anyway, because you're kind of sort of governed by the school curriculum and what the teacher profession wants you to do. But I can be very mindful. I can open my eyes to see what the children are doing. And of course, that became then my own doctoral thesis. So I continued with this. And and we say in English that we read for PhD, don't we? Because so much of it is just reading, trying to understand it. And by the time I'd kind of read so many books, there's a moment when you kind of think, okay, enough. And now I go and do the data collection. So I went continued to look at Urdu lessons, and I continued to look at Quranic lessons. And then I had lots and lots of data. Then begins the process of data analysis. So all that means is that you look at what in my case, what the children have said and what the teachers have said, and you begin to look at patterns. This was a qualitative study. So you look, what is it? What's emerging there? What are the children telling? And of course, they were always delighted to see me, whatever context I was in. So if I went to the mosque, they said, oh, I saw you at school the other day. And same back at school, they said, oh, Mrs. Robertson, you were at the mosque again.
Yes.
And then they started telling me that, let me show you. I want to show you how I do it. Or they might say, such and such is not doing it properly. They're cheating.
Right.
So there was a lot of this discussion about, from the children, that doing it, this is how you do it.
Yes.
And that was probably the lowest point of my doctoral study. I was thinking, so how come other people discover amazing things in their studies, and all I've discovered is that children say, this is how you do it.
Yes.
And I really nearly cried and gave it all up, until I began to look what's behind that statement, this is how you do it.
Yes.
When they say it from the three separate contexts, it means that they've learned how you do it in the mosque, how you do it in the Urdu class, and how you do it in the English class. Let me show you how capable I am already. And these children were 5 when I started working with them, and they were 7 when I finished. So I followed them in and out of these lessons for 2 years.
Yes, yes.
So what they're showing me is that they're not confused.
Yes, yes.
That's first what they want you to know.
Yes.
I show you how to do it.
Yes,
And
you said that in your article, Parallel Literacies.
Yes, yes.
Where you spoke about children speaking Pahari at home, going to learn Urdu, learn Arabic, speaking English. And you made the point that this was not a confusing matter, which I think many people, and you were speaking about your own personal experience as a first-time mother, being told not to speak Finnish because it would confuse the child. And of course, your children, and I've often said teachers of EAL, although I prefer the term bilingual, are people, if there's no one else, I think things have got better, though sometimes I think they're getting worse. But in the 70s, in the early days of multicultural education, often the person who the children saw as a friend, certainly Black and Asian children, saw as a friend was the EAL teacher. And in your case, I imagine they really appreciated you entering their world beyond the classroom.
Absolutely.
The fact that you were a teacher who came into their space, that they could now connect, and that might have encouraged them to become whole beings, not living compartmentalized lives. Did you find that?
So true. So true. And I was lucky that I worked with a couple teachers who were similarly minded. So one was an Irish teacher, and one was a English teacher, and then we had one teacher who was also from Pakistan, but from southern Pakistan, not from Kashmir. So we were similarly minded and were able to do this. I mean, it's not hard, is it, to give one afternoon and go and see what local other teachers do?
No, it's not.
It's not. It's not.
But only if you prioritize it.
Yes. Yes.
You know, there are times when I find that there's something takes half an hour for a meaningful interaction with somebody, a conversation or a meeting, but only if you prioritize it.
Only if you prioritize.
And only if you see its value. And of course, the funds of knowledge approach, the community funds of knowledge that has come along and encouraged people to go out.
Yes.
You know, sadly, the Swan report talked about commuter teachers. And I've talked about it in my own work, that we have many schools where teachers are hardworking, but they are nevertheless commuter people who come from somewhere, come into the school, may be working there 10, 20 years. I've never gone outside of the school gate walking. They drive in and out. And so the children are forced to have a school life and have a home life or have a wider community life that they never connect because the teacher is not able to understand.
Yes.
So I agree with you.
Yes, absolutely. And I still don't understand, why is it that we have we've got all sorts of guidance for teachers to for example, learn what children's prior learning is.
Yes.
Or what kind of, where do they come from, and all this kind of thing. And that it remains in the school building, that teachers don't go much out. And we used to do, as reception class teachers, of course, we used to do home visits quite a lot initially. But of course, there again, it's a bit of a scary moment when the teacher comes to visit you at home. You know, a lot of cleaning is involved, and all sort of trying to make the home look good. It's a very different kind of visit than what I was doing with the children. It's about relationships. It's about developing trust. And there were moments when I was totally challenged, for example, by one imam in the mosque asked me things like, "Do you believe in God?"
Yes.
And I had to say that I am sort of agnostic. I was taught to believe in God, but now I don't think so.
Yes, yes.
And I could see that something is happening here. A bit of a barrier is developing.
Yes.
Against us, between us. And then the other question, next one, was, you don't have rings on your fingers.
No.
Are you not married? And I said, that is true. I was married, but we have separated, and I am not living with my first husband.
Yes.
I was together, but with the man who became my second husband. Yes. And I could see that there was again this barrier. And I thought, well, I cannot but be honest.
Yes.
Cannot. Yes. And I felt that maybe this will just destroy whole of my study now, because this imam is not maybe happy with who I am. But that wasn't the case. That wasn't the case. He wasn't interested in the right kind of answer. But if I come to the mosque to study the children, then they need to know, am I a trustworthy person to do that?
Yes.
And he had a right to ask me questions. Obviously, I was totally shocked and almost went home crying and thinking, this, I bet I won't be able to go in. But the following time I went in, there's a cup of coffee and huge plate of biscuits for me, and I can never pretend that I became a Muslim person, because I am not. But they could see that I had the community, was important to me, and I had the children close to my heart, that and my brain. I wanted the teaching profession to understand what the children experience, but also the ones that I saw around me. I was also had very warm, good relationships based on trust and honesty. Yes,
I've spoken about bilingualism, deficit model of bilingualism, monolingualizing education, assimilationist, subtractive bilingualism. I think all of those have certainly been part of my experience as an immigrant in this country, especially as a visible immigrant. And yet there are benefits of bilingualism that you have spoken of. Do you want to, for the ordinary person who may be thinking bilingualism is confusing, what are the benefits? Why should we be bilingual?
Well, I think many children don't have that choice. They are. Yes. They're born to a context where mum and dad, or maybe speak one language or one parent speaks one language and another parent speaks another language, and they're born in that context. They absolutely have a right to learn those languages. It's not difficult. They have a right. More so, really, also for sort of long-term purposes. I have watched so many generations of children who might have spoken Pahari very well in their early childhood, or Finnish in their early childhood, or any of the London languages. And as the years go by, they become less and less fluent in that language. So much so that when they're sort of plus 20, 25, 30, they turn to their parents and say, why didn't you teach me my language? That it belongs to me, it's mine. And now when I FaceTime or visit family, I cannot communicate with them as well as I was able to when I was a little girl. Why did you let it happen? And more so when I go to these places that also belong to the children, or by then the adults, they say, now I feel like a tourist. They don't see me, they don't accept me anymore as a Finnish person or Kashmiri person, that I become something in between, in both places. Don't always feel I fit in here and I don't fit in here. So I'm in this sort of in the middle land. But why did it happen? And often the parents don't know what to say, because of course all parents want the best for their children. Now, if the teachers, if the people with power say that it's best if you don't teach. And even if they don't say it, of course, you can communicate an awful lot without actually making the statement as clearly as that. If there is a pressure on just using English, and the parents want the best for their children, it's no surprise that they then at some point begin to perhaps favor English. And they it's tragic, I think, and unnecessary. But one understands that the parents were not making those decisions in the conditions of their own choosing. So the conditions were such that they were already positioned as a bit of an outsider. And in order to gain a better entry into the insider school community, then the more they hear you speak English seems to benefit the children. But of course, this is not so. This is not so. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to happen with teachers. But, it also needs to happen with health professionals. It needs to happen with those nurses. I've just recently worked with nurses who give advice to parents, health visitors, when the child is 1, 2, and they might say something about nutrition. So they might also then say something about languages. And they often say that, well, yes, keep talking in your own language. That's really good. But by the time you come to school, it's best because, all that Quranic reading and all that, Urdu, is it really helpful? It might be best, for better results. And that, again, is not right. And it is not true, because, of course, the research shows that your brain is like any muscle. The more you use it, the more flexible it becomes. Different writers have talked about multilingual flexibility, how it's easy then to switch from language to language, and actually how it develops. The academics say that it improves the cognition, so it's a cognitive strength, and all that means that it enables you to be creative in your language, and for children to use all their thinking resources. So if they've got some ideas located in one language and then they've got another language with similar words, they can draw on both.
Yes.
And of course, in schools, the highest achievements often have been found to take place when children are able to draw on their thinking resources. And that is not only just for the learning benefit, but it is also for identity development, isn't it?
Yes.
They become more secure in who they are. They're okay with their parents' baggage, the migration baggage. They have fewer conversations like, well, Mum, why do you do that? Or Dad, that's, we don't do that anymore here in England. So they have fewer questions like that. They feel more secure in their own skin and in their own home and in their family relationships. So there's lots of benefits of bilingualism.
I think you in one of your articles and research pieces, you spoke about the life and contribution of Razia, the bilingual practitioner.
Yes.
Who, one of the words you used for her was a bridge.
Yes.
And there are many people in our community, Kashmiri community, and the wider Pakistani community, who work as bilingual practitioners and as teaching assistants or classroom teachers or senior leaders. And I was very interested in the word bridge you described. You remember that?
Yes, I do. Yes. So that is Razia herself said that.
Yes.
That she is the bridge. That she's a bridge in all sorts of ways. She's the the person welcoming all children in, but whereas often those who don't share her ethnicity or faith, and particularly language, just sort of might nod and walk past, whereas the ones who share her language and ethnicity sort of made eye contact and often came with a question. What is this? We've had this letter. What's happening at school? And she was able to bridge that because she knew she had been a migrant herself and knew what it was like with young children when you don't get it, what's going on at school. And I have to say that, of course, that's true to many parents, English speaking, whatever, that the early school practice, the early school years are a bit baffling for parents. When they go to parents' evenings, they have to sit on the little chairs and just hear jargon about phonics achievements and how children haven't learned graphemes or whatever. But so Razia had gone through this herself and was incredibly committed in teaching her own children Pahari.
Right.
And so she bridged with parents, but more importantly, she always talked to us that she bridged with the children's learning so that she knew what kind of home learning experiences the children had had at home. So she knew something about the funds of knowledge, as Moll is the writer who writes about funds of knowledge.
Yes.
So these are the kinds of networks that families have and practices, social practices, and they're often very situated practices. And all that means that they are unique to that local context, that if you have one kind of home practice in 1970s in one area, in 2022 it's slightly different. It's the situatedness means that it's sort of accrued different practices and technologies and all that, but she was more aware of what is going on at home, and she knew, for example, that often it wasn't so much the third child who struggled because the older siblings took such good care of the younger child. So she would often sort of support differently the ones who were the firstborns of a family. She knew the enormous role that grandparents played in the children's lives, and actually all of the family. So in England and many Western countries, European countries, we tend to think of family as sort of consisting of parents and children, no one else. Yeah. And of course, in many communities, it's much wider. It's the my own pupils in the primary school used to call them cousin sisters and cousin brothers. So they are in the same role as sisters and brothers, although they are.
So, I think minorities have to learn the majority language, as I did, and to a reasonable level. I sometimes wonder whether it would benefit people, monolingual, English-speaking, local majority community members, whether it would benefit them to learn a language other than English. I think people do learn European languages, but there are rare examples of people learning Punjabi or Pahari. Do you ever imagine that will happen?
I mean, of course, there are many teachers included who are multilingual. So in the schools, I trained so many of them who spoke another language at home. And what was staggering, again, were how this, and early years it often was women, they'd come to me and say, I'm going for my first teaching placement to practice to become a teacher. And I've realized that a lot of the children speak Turkish. And I am Turkish, I speak Turkish. Is it allowed for me to speak Turkish to them? So there is that huge barrier that other languages have to be kept outside the school. Would it benefit? No doubt it would. No doubt it would.
I think it's obvious with the globalized world that large sections of our society, people are bilingual, multilingual.
Yes.
So I think, it's becoming a norm to have, we talk about super diverse cities. They invariably are super diverse in terms of languages as well. I'm conscious of the time. Just one last question, which is, behind you there are many books. I'm sure you've read them all, and your brain is so big, and with all the languages it must make you very clever. Is there one book that you would pick out from your library that is special to you?
It's an impossible. I mean, yes, I could pick out many books. So
no, just one. You're only allowed one.
Just allowed one. Can I have two? Literature
go on.
And academic book.
Okay.
So I think the academic book I would go for a study by Shirley Bryce Heath that came out in early 1980s. And she did a study of three communities in the States. One was a Black American, one was white American working class, and one was white middle class. And she showed how different the communities were, how the practices in each one accrued rules. They were rule bound. Everyone shared those rules, and how the working class Black and working class white communities didn't have the same rules as the school community, the school had. And that had a huge impact on me. And just recently, I've been thinking about it again, how profound that book was. As for literature, honestly, it's really difficult to say. I read ferociously. I read poetry. I've got a lovely Bulgarian book of poetry there. I read Shakespeare when I can and feel kind of up to it. And I suppose one of my long term favorites is Virginia Woolf, a British writer.
Right.
Her book To the Lighthouse. So that I select that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. And I will, I've not read either of these. Maybe I will look them up. But for now, it leaves me to say thank you for giving me your time. Yours was probably 15 years ago, when I started to research and had access to the academic world. And I will have searched for Pahari and will have come across your work, which invariably was affirming for me that not only do we have a language which often people are not interested, including sometimes our own community, but here are academics, people like yourself, and there are a few others who have researched it. And so thank you for doing that. And long may it continue that you are blessed with your work. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.